All right, so our next presenter is going to be Kallie Bontrager with the DNR. She is going to discuss with us about Japanese knotweed troubles and things like that, and go from there. So, Kallie, did you want to try sharing your screen, or do you want me to do it?
I'm going to try and share my screen. We'll see what happens.
All right. If there's a little bit of a glimpse, we may switch topics because internet connectivity is always fun. So, all right, awesome. Well, with no further ado, I'm going to let you go, Kallie, and I appreciate you joining us this morning.
Okay, that's better. We're getting closer. Maybe.
You are good. You just, if you put it in presentation mode, you should be good, Kallie.
Okay, presentation mode is slide sorter, slideshow.
There you go, slideshow.
Okay, there it goes. I clicked on it once and I didn't want to do it. Okay. Yep. Are we ready?
Go ahead. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for having me here. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kallie Bontrager. I'm with the Department of Natural Resources, Division of Entomology and Plant Pathology, which is bugs and blights. So I cover the Northwest, what we call the Northwest Territory, which is everybody in the Central Time Zone up here. So, and then I do Pulaski a little bit. I cover Pulaski also, even though they go back and forth depending what part of Pulaski you're actually in. So my main job is I'm a nursery inspector and compliance officer. So part of the time I spend running around looking at people's plants that they're going to sell. I check up on the nursery dealers, especially the big box stores that get a lot of stuff in. If we did a lot of time this spring with invasive, the Indiana terrestrial plant law. So we're looking at plants coming in that weren't supposed to be being sold. We do deal with invasive species all the way around. We do quite a bit of everything, it seems like. So I'm going to talk about Japanese knotweed today, and I'm going to go through just some general stuff about it, and then maybe take some questions at the end if I don't get too long-winded. So Japanese knotweed is on our terrestrial plant law. It's known by at least 3 different scientific names, and we have all 3 on the terrestrial plant law. So anybody that's trying to get it in can't get it around by naming it, saying it's a different scientific name, because we run into that. It's originally native to Japan and China and some parts of Korea and Taiwan. It's presently in all over the globe right now. Most of the European countries, UK has a big problem with it. Canada, Australia, Germany, New Zealand, Chile. I think Chile might be one of the few South American ones, but that's the only one I saw for sure. So it is definitely a problem all across the globe. So here in the United States, it was introduced in the late 1800s, pretty much more as an ornamental, because it is pretty and it does grow very quickly. Some people are using it almost as hedgerows. By the 1900s, it was becoming established in the eastern states. As of right now, I think there are 43 states that have actually reported it in the United States. Indiana being one of them, and I think in Indiana, just about all of the counties in Indiana, except maybe 2 or 3, have actually reported it. Yeah. This is from EdMaps. Thank you, EdMaps. It was nice to be able to pull this up and get an idea of where it's been actually reported from the EdMaps, though it doesn't show the full 43 states, but it does show what EdMaps is seeing. And if you look at Indiana, we're pretty much, it's been reported all through Indiana, unfortunately. And in my territory up here in the northwest part of the state, I don't know, I drive a lot. And one place that really comes to mind is driving US 30 going west towards Maryville out of Valpo. There's a big patch of it along there. So it's really obvious once you know what you're looking at. It's also been known as Mexican bamboo, Renostria, Japanese fleece flower. There's a lot of different names. It is a perennial that's kind of semi-woody. When it dies back for the year, the stems actually kind of look like bamboo. It forms really dense clumps that are very tall. They can get up to 15 feet tall. The stems are kind of glaucous, kind of shiny, and they're reddish colored when they first emerge, and then they turn green, but still sometimes have a speckle of red in them. The node where the leaf meets the stem is really swollen. The leaves are very big, kind of roundish, kind of triangular with a point at the end. If the flowers weren't actually in panicles and groups, you probably wouldn't really notice them because they're very, very small individually, but they are on panicles, so it's really obvious. The fruit is 3-winged, and the inside the actual fruit itself is kind of a shiny black seed. The really big problem with it are the rhizomes, because the rhizomes can reach up to 15 feet long, and they are really hard to get rid of. Okay, so the height of it, I mean, it can go from emerging as a perennial to 15 feet by the end of summer. So this gives you an idea of how big this perennial can get and what kind of clumps it gets into. So there's this gentleman in there in the middle of them. I'm not quite sure what he was doing. It was just a great picture to show height-wise what Japanese knotweed looks like. These are the actual seeds. They're not really big. They're like a third of an inch long when it comes down to it. They've got that 3-winged kind of a papery covering, whitish covering on the outside. So they can be dispersed by wind, and birds will just use the seeds and disperse them. But this isn't, sometimes they're not fertile. So this isn't the main way it actually spreads. It does spread. If these seeds drop into the water, they will float quite a while. And if they're fertile, they will spread by that. But that's not the main way they spread. The main way this plant actually spreads is by rhizomes. This is a picture of a stem, probably more into getting into late spring into summer. You can kind of see the swollen nodes, the kind of shiny stem, greenish with the red specklings on them. So it's very erect. When they grow it, they tend to be really, really erect. The leaves, this is the leaves. They are what we call broadly ovate with tapering to that nice point, but they can be really big. They're 2 to 6 inches long, and I think anywhere from 2 to 5 inches wide. So it is a very large leaf, and when it's in full growth, it does shade out everything underneath them. It's really hard for anything to grow under a clump of this Japanese knotweed. Good picture of the flowers. It is a pretty flower. It's actually a pretty plant. It's too bad it's so invasive. As I said, the flowers are really tiny. They tend to be a whitish green, but they grow on panicles and groups. So when it's flowering, they are really obvious when you see them flowering. But that's another identification of them. So we first start seeing the plant emerging early spring, and it just starts out as if in that top left corner, just looks like little red buds coming up, almost like asparagus is what it first looks like when it comes up, kind of that kind of shape. Especially when they start breaking bud and they start growing, and you can see in the third picture as you come around the circle is they really do resemble asparagus, young asparagus at this time. And actually in Asia, they are cut at this time and used. I have not tried it. I don't know that I want to, because I'd rather not see any of this plant. As it continues to grow, depending on where it's at, it really starts to grow very quickly. And since it grows so quickly, it can displace and really crowd out any native vegetation. There's been some studies that show that it also might have an inhibiting effect on anything trying to grow underneath it or around it. So I think there's still ongoing studies about that. By the end of the growing season, it's up to 15 foot tall. So it's really will crowd things out. When it dies back in the winter, you can see in that far left picture that it's just a bunch of brown stems, and having nothing growing underneath it, it's pretty unsightly in your landscape. So I'm just going to go through real quick, get a closer picture. So these are your spring pictures, what you first start seeing. You know, you might not notice it right off the bat unless you already know you've got a group of them in your area when they first start breaking bud. As they continue to grow, they become really obvious in areas, especially when they get to the full size of what they are. I mean, it's amazing. I wish I'd taken some pictures this summer of them, and I should have. As I was driving by, I thought about it a lot when I was driving by on 30, or there's a spot in Westville off of a county road that I know of that I was like, oh, I should stop and take those pictures, and I never took the time to do it. About this time of year, this is what you're going to be seeing. They tend to stay greener a little bit later than some of the other plants around them, some of the other perennials. So they start turning a yellowish color, but I'm right, depending on how dry it is, but they don't seem to mind the drought too much either. And this is winter again. So you see it's just kind of brown stems. If you look at the end you can see it's a hollow sweet family, I believe. So it can become a little dangerous if you've cut it down and you're trying to walk across it or put something on it. So those stems can get pretty sharp. So what's the big problem about Japanese knotweed? It's been around for a long time, but why do we worry about it? There's several reasons we really worry about it. I've touched on some of them. Overall, it's native habitat. It tends to like moist, open, sunny to partially shaded areas. That being said, it can tolerate a wide variety of conditions. It doesn't mind full shade. It can get into almost it can do full sun to almost full shade. It doesn't seem to mind high temperatures. It doesn't seem to have like winter kill back as far as killing the roots. It doesn't mind salinity. It doesn't mind drought. It really likes to go into areas that have been disturbed, where it can get a fresh start and colonize an area very easily. It does, like I said, you see it on roadways a lot, I think, because of the fact that there might be a little ditch along the roadway, and seeds might have got it started, and once it gets into a really nice area, it really spreads out very, very quickly. So that's one thing, is it has so many conditions it can tolerate. That's one of the things that make it really difficult to control. You can't just say, oh, it's only going to be here, it's only going to be there. Again, it's very fast growing. Since it's a perennial that goes from nothing, from the ground to 15 feet by the end of summer. And it spreads out very, very quickly along the rhizomes. So, when it's that fast growing and spreads out that quickly, it kind of reminds me to a certain extent of kudzu, though it doesn't grow as fast as kudzu does, kudzu being a vine, but it does have that kind of quick growth that, we look at that will really outcompete any natives we've got and outshade them. Monoculture, again, that once it gets into an area and spreads out, it grows so quickly, it outcompetes with any natives. And then it was kind of like when Phil was talking about the burning bush, nothing can grow underneath it. So even once it dies back in the winter, there's nothing there, and there's not much that feeds on it, unfortunately. So we get these huge stands of just Japanese knotweed, and it's any of our native flowers or anything like that has been totally shaded out. Makes for a really hard area for anything to live. And this is where we get to really how hard it becomes to eradicate. The rhizomes are what it makes this really, really difficult, because these rhizomes get very thick and they grow up to 10 feet. And this is where the plant comes from most of the time. It's not the seed population. it's a vegetative sprouter. So it sprouts right off of these rhizomes. So if any of these rhizomes break off, they'll grow still. So if you're pulling it out, it's really hard to get. The same thing if you're trying to just cut it back, if you're missing parts or you're spreading parts of the rhizomes or the plant, sometimes it'll even grow from the plant itself that's been cut back. So eradicating this is a very time-consuming project. Again, very, very adaptable. It doesn't need much soil to grow in. It does like the roadsides, probably because it tends to be moist or very disturbed areas, and it can colonize those very quickly. But even if you look at the left-hand picture, this has actually managed to colonize along cracks between the wall and the sidewalk there. So it doesn't take much to get this particular plant growing. There are some control methods out there, depending on how big of a stand of Japanese knotweed you have, and it varies. None of them's really, there's no set thing really. Sometimes it's better with two-pronged. You can go anywhere from manual removal, if you can pull out the young when they first starting to sprout, the young ones in the spring, the young plants, or dig them out. Again, but when you're doing any kind of digging or pulling, you have to make sure you get those rhizomes all the way out, because if you leave any bit, they're just going to sprout back up. There are places that actually go in with excavators to try and just dig out that top layer and get rid of these plants. It was interesting looking at some more of this stuff about what's going on in the UK and how much trouble they're having with it. So the thing is when you do try and do any kind of removal, it's got to be bagged. It can't be composted unless you can lay it out on a tarp where it can't be blown away and it can just dry totally out. I mean, but it's got to be totally dry before you can do anything with it. So you can do that manually, lots labor intensive. In small areas for a homeowner, they might be able to do this. You might be able to do this and combine it with herbicides, and I'll talk about those here in a sec. Another idea for homeowners or small areas is actually smothering it, and this is good for sensitive areas too, where you might not be able to do herbicides or you don't want to disturb the land that much. The idea is to cut it off close to the ground, and then you take a tarp of some sort that's really dark and cover the whole area plus 5 feet beyond, because sometimes those plants will shoot sideways and try and get out from underneath that tarp if there's a chance. So I guess 5 feet has been researched that usually if you cover beyond those 5 feet, you've got it. That tarp will keep the light from coming in, and it will also restrict the water. So the thing is if you've cut it off, as those stems dry out, they do get sharp. So sometimes if they continue to grow a little bit, they might try and pop out through that tarp. So it's got to be a pretty heavy duty tarp, and it's got to be covered for at least a season, preferably 2. I mean, if you can cover it from spring into winter, that hopefully will take care of what's going on. Again, this is really more ideal for small areas that you might find right off the bat. Herbicide is another one. There's the cut stump method, which again is probably going to work best for areas that are sensitive, where there's a lot of non-target plants that you don't want to just spray a foliar. So what happens is you go in and cut the stem about 2 inches up, and then spray it spray it with either glyphosate or triclopyr, both at about 25% water solution. And the problem with that is even after that, you still have to monitor it. You might have to come back and control, seedlings again. Foliar spray is just what it sounds like. You're treating the foliage as much as you can with 2% glyphosate or trichloropril. You best bet when you do either one of these is to use a surfactant to help penetrate the cuticle, the leaf cuticle especially. It can keep it protected a bit. It's been shown that there's been some research that fall is a more effective time to be treating this particular plant, as the leaves are translocating down to the rhizomes. So it's taking all the way down the rhizomes and hopefully killing that off. Usually you have to do a couple years of this because of whether seedlings or, you know, you might not get all the leaves treated. So some of the rhizomes don't get affected. It's just a really tough plant to deal with, as most invasives are. That's why they're invasive, is because there's usually no really easy way to take care of it. There is research ongoing for biological control. This is a type of psyllid that actually will attack the leaf, and in large enough numbers can stress the plant out enough to keep it under control. It won't kill it. Very unlikely that it'll kill it, but it does help keep it in control in its native range. Some of the other things that have been out there looked at, there's some leaf, there's a fungus out there that they're looking at in the native range, whether it'll do anything. There's some leaf spots, diseases and things. But again, most of this stuff is still in the research stage. It's really hard it takes a long time to go from the research stage to being able to just put out biological controls. We've been through that already with other biological controls of just mass releasing them before they were looked at. So that's pretty much where we're at with Japanese knotweed. As far as the state of Indiana goes, we ourselves aren't doing any treatment. Our division is really, really tiny. And so, but I am more than happy to assist anybody. It's kind of something that's going to be done on a county or community level. Like I said, I'm here to answer questions and try and help give some ideas or identify things. It is on our terrestrial plant law, so it cannot be grown, sold, or moved or given away or any of that stuff. So that's probably not a big thing for you folks, but if you happen to see it out in sales, which I haven't seen it actually being sold anywhere, please let me know and we'll get it taken care of. So I think that's it. If anybody's got any questions, did I go too fast or too slow, Nikki?
You are pretty good. So
Oh, good.
Definitely do have time for some questions. I do know I had seen a couple in the chat. Do you want me to read them to you?
Sure.
The first one is, will knotweed grow well in the shade?
It won't grow well. It does grow in the shade. It will not grow as fast in the shade. I'm not sure how big but it will still grow in in large enough areas to kill out anything underneath it. And really, especially in areas where you might have paths that might be a little bit more sunlight or a tree falling, especially near a waterway where it might be able to either be seeded in or unfortunately brought in on somebody's boots or whatever. But yeah, it will grow in the shade.
All right. I'm going to ask this one.
Okay.
It sounds like you may have already answered it, but just so that we all hear the answer. So for invasives that grow close to watersheds, creeks, and environmentally sensitive environments, is there a different approach, I think it's just other than herbicides?
Yes, for this particular plant, you can try just doing a cut method and then smothering it. I know in some areas, continually cutting it all year long helps keep it under control. But the big thing about that is you got to make sure it's not spraying anything out into the waterways to have it transported downstream. So it's a lot more intensive. But it is possible. It'll take a lot longer. But if you can, smothering it's the best way to do it for that, or trying to dig it out. But if you're digging it out along a waterway, you're going to run into erosion problems. So, as soon as you start pulling that dirt away, because you have to get down and get all those rhizomes out of there. Does that kind of answer the question?
We'll see if they bring anything else up. And if anybody else does yes, it does.
Okay, thank you.
So if anybody else has any further questions, you can either unmute or keep typing in the chat pod.
So
another minute.
I'm not sure if you covered this, but my question is, we talked about the rhizome spreading, but if you cut the stems and they go float down the creek or whatever, will the stems resprout? Is that a method for spreading as well?
Yes, unfortunately, there's been some studies and shown that, yeah, that is some ways that they unfortunately will sprout out, especially if they're fairly, if they're nice and green, and then they get somewhere where they're kind of lodged into some dirt and stuff, they will resprout.
Kelly, I'd like to offer a follow-up. So, because you mentioned on the waterways, you mentioned that, well, you could dig it out. Would there be any recommendation, like on the waterways, to help reclaim that bank of doing either an immediate replanting of something else or putting like riprap rocks or something else to help stabilize that bank either in the interim or?
Yeah, definitely have to do something to stabilize the bank. I had a list of things that could be planted in lieu of it, but I don't have it anywhere near me and I can't remember them off the top of my head. But yeah, I think actually doing two things, trying to replant and then putting down some kind of barrier to help control the erosion. You'd want to do both to try and reclaim that right away. Yeah.
Yeah, I know stuff about stream bank restoration, but there's things you can plant like willow stakes and stuff like that will take over a site pretty quickly to control erosion. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah.
Okay. And Callie, you're able to stick on if some more questions do arise in the chat pod?
Yeah. Yep. This was my plan for this morning, is if I'm going to have to talk, I might as well listen to the rest of it.
Oh, I'm glad that you wrote that. So if you do have any further questions or something does pop up, I definitely don't want to limit discussions, but I know sometimes it takes a little bit for things to sink in and settle in. So
yeah,
you will stay around and we can come back to any questions that do arise. So
yep. And thanks for inviting me to talk. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was very nice and informative. So with that, we will move on to our next speaker, Jared Brook, who is going to talk, I'm going to say in general, about now Phragmites and the issues that they may cause.